Even in this freezing winter, Delhi is now burning. The power centers in Delhi are now sweating in the heat of an unprecedented storm of rage. Farmers are waging a determined struggle against those who are hell bent on making their lives a hell. The ones who are ruling this country for and on behalf of the corporate elite at the cost of the people of this nation. The struggle is not for just the farmers though. Just like how the farmers of this country sow and reap for all of us, to feed all of us, they are now fighting on behalf of all of us, the people of this country, whose food security is at stake, whose democratic rights are at stake, and eventually whose very survival would be at stake. That's why the farmers' struggle needs the support of whole of India, every single citizen, including you and me. What was the motivation for the government to rush in the new farm bills now when the whole nation is preoccupied in the fight against the pandemic, even flouting all democratic norms and procedures? Niti Aayog, interestingly, gives the answer. It says, quote, the country is witnessing the accumulation of a large surplus of grain and sugar, which is getting increasingly difficult to dispose of in the overseas markets due to poor price competitiveness of our produce. We need to reduce the logistic cost at least by half, unquote. It adds, quote again, according to the emerging scenario of demand and supply, India will be required to sell 20 to 25% of incremental agri-food production in overseas markets in the coming years, unquote. Niti Aayog CEO, as India transitioned from a food deficit nation to a surplus one, the focus of policy has rightly shifted to surplus management from deficit management. So it becomes evident the government's eye is on the profiteering opportunity of the export market, making use of the surplus, and it wants to hand over the Indian agriculture sector to the corporate on a platter for them to leverage and exploit the said opportunity. No wonder so many corporate companies have mushroomed in the recent times to exploit and profit from the farmers' toil. The government aims to reduce the cost by engaging only a few big players in the agriculture sector and hence want to drive away all the marginal small and medium farmers from the field. These new farm bills target to achieve exactly that. Were those poor farmers who eventually would get evicted from their own land because of the so-called reforms should go to? Well, the government is least concerned about that. They simply don't care. The new farm bills are nothing but a move to remove all the obstacles from the corporate to operate seamlessly, unhindered and unquestioned. These acts are essentially to allay the fears of the corporate and investors of regulatory interference by state or anyone else in their business operation and give the corporate a free hand to go ahead with their green conquest. A conquest that would make the Indian agriculture fields an assembly line for the agro-corporate while turning them to death fields for the farmers. While the bureaucrats of the Niti Aayog talk about surplus, look at what the Global Hunger Index says. As per the GHI, India is almost at the rock bottom of the list, having highest number of people who stay hungry. India has in recent times further fallen to an embarrassingly low position in the list, 94th rank among 107 countries, even below the likes of Pakistan, Bangladesh and Nepal. The glaring number says it all. It leaves no room for doubt that our farmers who are giving us the surplus are staying hungry. Does one need any expert economist to suggest where that surplus must go? Isn't it criminal to talk about surplus and export on the face of those millions of small children who go to bed every day empty stomach? An estimate shows 3,000 children die of hunger every day in India. Isn't it utterly shameful to know that 65 lakhs of tons of grain went rotten in the godowns in just 4 months while the people were going hungry in these difficult times of extreme distress due to COVID pandemic? Shouldn't those empty stomachs be the priority of any government which has at least an iota of sympathy towards its people? Clearly, the priorities of those in power lie elsewhere. Their priority is to feed the corporate for whom they rule, even at the cost of farmers, workers, and those who are toiling day in and day out to meet the ends. This is exactly what is neoliberal politics. Niti Aayog has spelled in no uncertain terms what the objective of these new farm acts are. As they say, the new act take forward the unfinished agenda of reforms started in 1991. No wonder the Niti Aayog CEO argues that there is too much democracy, as it is these remaining little democratic forces in the country that come in their way, trying to scuttle their attempts to loot this nation to fill the coffers of a few corporate neo-rich. Farmers do realize that the bell tolls for them and the toiling poor around. The farmers do realize that they have no option but to fight for survival lest perish. The three farm acts are clearly an attempt to offer the Indian agriculture sector to the agro-corporate houses, throwing the farmers into deep, untold, unending miseries, even to the extent of leading them to extinction. Farmers are well aware that these acts will make their lives more miserable, and hence they have joined hands to host one of the massive people upraising against the government that India has not witnessed for a long while. But as said, the current struggle is not for the sake of farmers alone. The new farm acts would impact not only farmers but a vast majority of people, particularly the poorer section of this country. Our food security, our democratic rights, our country's future are all at stake, and thus we all owe our support to farmers in this historic struggle. The true nefarious intent, underpinning agenda, and far-reaching implications of these acts must be thoroughly exposed and publicized among the mass and gather widespread support for the farmers' struggle. To start with, these bills are completely undemocratic and unconstitutional, both in terms of their content as well as the manner in which they were made into law. The three new farm acts were initially brought in as ordinances in the month of June 2020. In fact, the farmers were staging protests in various parts of the country immediately after the ordinance were brought in. And the struggle has only grown big and intense since then. New bills were brought in the parliament to replace the earlier ordinances and were made into laws in the month of September this year in a most undemocratic manner. Not only that, these bills were formulated without holding any consultation whatsoever with any of the key stakeholders, especially the farmers or their organizations. The government didn't even allow any meaningful debate in the parliament, and instead the whole democratic process was scuttled by suspending the opposition members, avoiding any discussion in the upper house, and opting to pass the bill by voice voting. No wonder the bills reflect a complete lack of understanding of the ground realities of rural India and the crucial role agriculture play in the livelihood of the people living in there. No doubt the bills were dictated by the corporate, and the government acted as a willing partner in this crime. So the new farm acts should be objected for three key reasons. First one is, these acts are a total farce on democracy and constitution and are an attack on the very federal structure of our nation. If we go by the spirit of the constitution and the federalism it advocates, agriculture is primarily a state subject, and it is left to individual states to form necessary acts and guidelines that would best suit their unique needs. Though some of the other provisions mentioned in the Constitution may be cited as legal justification for the Union government's intervention in the subject, the new acts have no place for the voice of the states and thus give scant regard to the federal structure and principles of our Constitution. The Act reads, quote, "This Act will have overriding effect on all state APMC Acts," unquote. Such arrogance and audacity of power to simply void state powers is a grave threat to our cooperative federalism and should not go unopposed. Another equally important transgression into constitutional rights is how the fundamental constitutional right of every citizen to seek legal remedies in courts is taken away. This may be used as a template in the future legislations as well, if it is allowed to go unopposed, where our democratic constitutional right to take the grievances to courts will be curtailed and the government will start positioning itself as a complainant, prosecutor and the judge all in one. Thus, the bills must be questioned for its violation of all democratic and constitutional norms. The second reason is that these acts are against the interest of the farmers, plain and simple. The bills would evict millions of farmers from their land and their traditional livelihood, making them jobless, and would convert Indian agriculture into a pure corporate monopoly. Our policymakers say there are too many people engaged in the agriculture sector and the numbers should be drastically reduced. What they don't say is where the millions of displaced poor farmers should turn to for their livelihood. They're silent on that. And the third reason is these acts will have far-reaching consequences, affecting adversely our hard-earned agricultural self-sufficiency and most importantly our food security. The acts will also pave way for endangering the biodiversity and the crops pattern, as it would be the agro-corporate who would be in control of the agro inputs, including the seeds and choice of crops, and would be the one deciding what to grow, when, where, and who would grow. It's very ironical and amusing to notice how misleading the names of these acts are. In fact, the names suggest desperate attempt by those involved to conceal the real intent of the bills. It's as if the label reads sugar while the bottle is filled with cyanide. The first act is named as Farmers Produce, Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act 2020. And the second act is named as Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement of Price Assurance and Farm Services Act 2020. What the bill lacked for farmers is exactly what are there in the titles, namely protection, empowerment, price assurance and promotion. The bills take away all the above from the farmers. The third bill read Essential Commodity Amendment Act 2020, and what it does is exactly the opposite, defining the very essential foodstuffs, including the basic food items like rice, wheat, potato, and onion as non-essentials. So, we must strictly warn those unsuspecting innocent souls who want to go by the titles and the government's hollow words, not to go by the label and swallow what is there in those bottles. As we all know, India still remains predominantly an agricultural economy. Almost half of our population, 42%, is engaged in farming and associated activities for their livelihood. 86% of these farmers are marginal and small scale farmers having less than 2 acres to 5 acres of land. What this implies is that any change in the agriculture sector in our country will directly impact almost half of the population. Thus, for a huge section of our population, these farm acts are a matter of their life and death. And that is why they dare all odds to wage the battle of their lives. With more than 12,000 farmers resorting to suicide every year, these acts will only worsen their plight. If we dive a little deeper into the content of these acts, we would realize how draconian and anti-farmer these bills are in reality. The first act is Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act 2020. This act primarily lifts the existing restrictions on farmers and traders to do transactions outside the APMC markets. Farmers will be allowed to trade their agricultural products outside the market areas operated under various state APMC acts. This act essentially bypasses the APMC system and override all the state level legislations in force which regulate market for the agricultural produce in various states. Thus, the states will no more have any say on a subject that is designated as a state subject in the Constitution. The Act also prohibits state governments or APMC from charging any cess, levy or any taxes at these private market trade areas, which is outside the APMC market yards. The government version is that this act gives freedom to the farmers to sell their produce wherever they want and to whomever they want. Government projects this act as creating an alternate free market where farmers will get freedom of choice to trade with anyone, anywhere in India. On the face of it, this would look like a step to help farmers to fetch higher price for their produce. However, this argument will not stand the scrutiny of anyone who has even basic understanding of how the so-called free market operates. In reality, the farm acts are akin to pulling away the security net provided to the farmers and in turn pushing them into these shark-infested deep waters and claiming, hey, they are being offered the freedom to swim wherever they want. Leave alone swimming, they would only be eaten up by the sharks in there. This so-called freedom narrative is only a cover to conceal the actual intent underneath. It is like unbolting the chicken coop, the hen house, on the pretext of freeing the chickens, while the actual intent is to let the fox enter the coop. Actually, the APMC trade restrictions, if we could call it as restrictions, are meant to protect farmers from exploitation rather than curtailing freedom. For a guy who earned barely, say, 100 rupees a day, it's absurd and cruel to offer the so-called freedom to dine at any of the five-star restaurants in any of the cities across India. The so-called freedom of choice in this instance means absolutely nothing for him. It is rather a mockery on his plight. What would make sense for him is to have his nearby dhaba able to offer him his daily meals with what he can afford to pay. So this whole argument of freedom to sell anywhere to anyone is totally bogus and a complete eyewash. If the government think majority of the farmers will have wherewithal to travel to faraway places to sell his produce, they are living in fool's heaven, removed far from the reality. But it is not that they are not aware of it. They just want to act ignorant, as the actual intent is to lure the farmers away from the safety net of APMC and make them perish so that the corporate can take over all for themselves. The farmers do realize this and they are not interested in the promise of this hollow freedom. For them, the existing APMC system that has worked well despite all its limitations is what matters the most. They foresee a grave threat to the existence of APMC mandis once the new acts become operational, which will turn them helpless and leave them exposed to the potential gruesome attacks by the corporate predators. What is concealed in this misleading government narrative of freedom of choice is that the restrictions inbuilt into the current APMC system is in fact an inherent safety net to protect the farmers from being pressurized to sell their produce in distress to their lenders and other scrupulous traders and intermediaries. APMC system is essentially to protect farmers from exploitation and to ensure they get a minimum support price (MSP) for their produce. APMC, Agriculture Produce Marketing Committees, markets or mandis were established to enable farmers to sell their produce at a fair price and to protect them from traders, money lenders, and middlemen taking away their produce for pittance. How the APMC operates is it divides the states into several zones, and all the farmers in a particular zone are supposed to trade their produce only in the APMC mandis designated for them for that region. The traders are not allowed to enter into trade outside these mandis. This restriction is to actually avoid traders coercing farmers into selling their produce at much lower price than the minimum support price. Thus, the restrictions imposed on trade outside the APMC mandis are in fact to ensure that the farmers are not forced to give away their produce to the traders and agents, as many of these traders and agents would be the ones extending financial loans as well to these farmers. In other words, the insistence to sell only inside the APMC mandis is not a restraint but a mechanism inbuilt to protect the farmer's interest. The producers are auctioned in the mandis, and the RTAs, the registered commission agents, purchase this produce from the farmers on behalf of the government agencies like FCI or other private traders and exporters. RTAs in fact also provide other services like cleaning these produce for farmers and loading them and packaging. Also, many of them finance these farmers, giving them the loans to meet the expenses. These agents are paid commission by the buyers like FCA and private traders, not by farmers. Mandis also charge taxes which are used by the state governments to improve the infrastructure and other agricultural related services. To ensure the safeguarding of farmers' interests, the APMC mandis impose conditions like one, for all producers where the government has announced minimum support prices, the products cannot be sold at a price below MSP. Second, inside all APMC regions, the farmers and traders can enter into wholesale trade only inside the designated mandis, not outside. And that is precisely to avoid traders forcing farmers to sell them at whatever price they want outside these mandis. The new act provides to create private markets or trade areas outside the APMC system where both these conditions will not be applicable. There will be no minimum support price, and neither there will be any restrictions on where and whom the traders and companies can buy farm produce. There would be no need to register or obtain licenses for the traders. And thus, any individuals or groups or corporate can buy produce from the farmers. State government is prohibited to charge any cess, levies or taxes in these private markets from anyone. With the newfound license and golden opportunity to force farmers to sell their produce anywhere at any price, the traders and the agents and the corporate will desert the APMC mandis and take the trade outside and coerce the farmers to submit to them through various means. This will only weaken the mandi system and will force farmers to sell their produce at much lower price at these private trade areas, as no alternate venues will be available for them to dispose of their produce. As we know, the farming involves a lot of uncertainties and risks. Between the sowing and harvesting, lot many factors may adversely impact the outcome. So it's critical to make sure that the farmers get a reasonable income above and beyond what they have to spend to produce the crops. Only then they can sustain farming and produce foodstuffs to feed the nation. Enforcement of minimum support price (MSPs) on selected producers are to ensure that the farmers would get at least a minimum price to cover their cost of production. If not for MSP, traders will bring down the price at the time of harvesting and the farmers will be forced to sell at throwaway prices, pushing them into huge debts. Thus, MSP is very crucial in providing the required support to the farmers. Most of the farmers live in small houses with one or two rooms, and telling them that they could store their produce as long as they wish and sell whenever they want at the price they decide is totally unrealistic. These farmers won't have adequate storage facilities and hence will be looking to dispose of their produce at the earliest. Moreover, the farmers will have to sell their produce immediately after the harvest to settle their loans and pay for their other living expenses, including children's education, medical needs, etc. So, the agents and financiers will try to take advantage of these distress situations and will try to squeeze maximum out of the poor farmers. Eventually, the farmers would be left with nothing. They would be forced to ultimately sell their land to come out of the debt trap. It's precisely to avoid this situation and save farmers from this distress sale that the APMC Mandi system was introduced. The new act is destroying farmers' life support ecosystem by paving the way for dismantling these very APMC Mandis. Government should rather focus on expanding the APMC system and build more Mandis, fixing the loopholes, than completely destroying APMC system for all practical purposes and leaving farmers at the mercy of the traders and the corporate. Majority of the marginal small and medium farmers with very little bargaining power will be pushed out of the new system and rapidly will move out of farming, which is precisely what the corporate and the government are looking for. So this act is not an accident, but a well-planned strategy to get rid of small farmers and hand over the agriculture entirely to the mega agro-corporate. Bihar provides one of the glaring examples of what can be expected to happen if APMC vanishes. In Bihar, where the APMC system was discontinued in the year 2006, farmers are forced to sell paddy for rupees 600 or 700 a quintal, while the government MSP stands at rupees 1800 plus. In fact, the plight of the farmers there is so pathetic that majority of them don't produce enough to even to take to the market for trading. Many farmers have left farming forever and were forced to migrate to other states in search of daily wages and casual labor. This Farm Act targets to replicate the same story across the country so that the field would be left open for the corporate to play at their will and by their own rules. This act also takes utmost care to protect corporate from having to face any legal consequences. Not only farmers, even no citizen are allowed to take their grievances to the court. Corporate don't want to be bothered with the law of the land and the government readily oblige, taking away the fundamental rights of the citizen in the process. Section 13 of the Act reads like this, quote, no suit, prosecution, or other legal proceedings shall lie against the central government or the state government or any other person in respect of anything which is in good faith done or intended to be done under this ordinance or of any rules or orders made thereunder. Pretty much taking care of all scenarios. Anything done in good faith or even planning to do in good faith. Section 15 of the Act reads like this. No civil court have jurisdiction to entertain any suit or proceedings in respect of any matter, the cognizance of which can be taken and disposed of by any authority empowered by or under this ordinance or the rules made thereunder. Such blatant disregard for the citizen's constitutional right is unheard of. Now let's look at Act 2. It's named as Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement of Price Assurance Farm Services Act 2020. This act is about contract farming. The act puts a framework for the farmers to enter into agreement with buyers and other third parties involved in advance before they sow their crop to sell the final produce at a prefixed price. It's an agreement-based cultivation of pre-decided crops of predetermined quality, quantity, grade, etc. by farmers on behalf of a sponsor who can be a trader, a corporate company, or any other entity. The farmers are obligated to fulfill the contract conditions, and the sponsor is liable to purchase and pay for the produce only if all the conditions, including quality, quantity, and other parameters, like even the pesticide residue left on the grain, moisture content, etc., as stipulated in the agreements, are met. The Act basically talks about two forms of agreement. First one is trade and commerce agreement. Farmers are paid when they deliver the final produce. The buyer is not responsible for anything if the produce is not delivered. That is, the farmer will be solely responsible if their crop is damaged for some reason or the other. The entire loss will have to be borne only by the farmer. The second type of agreement is production agreement. The buyer will be providing farm services, including providing seed, fertilizers, machinery, and other inputs and advice. And the farmers are paid just for whatever service the farmer provides, not necessarily even the price for the produce. And most importantly, the contract doesn't need to specify any minimum support price at all. The contract will specify, though, the quality and standard that should be met by the final produce for the sponsor to take the delivery. The sponsor can always decline to purchase the product, citing any reason, like the final produce not meeting any of the terms specified in the agreement, and can use it to either reject the entire lot or to lower the price considerably. Even the amount of pesticide residue, as I mentioned before, on the final produce can be a reason to decline the product. With no option to seek legal remedies and absolutely no means to fight with the battery of corporate lawyers, farmers will be completely at the mercy of the corporate houses. For example, Clause 4.1 reads like this. The parties entering into a farming agreement may identify and require as a condition of the performance of such agreement compliance with mutually acceptable quality, grade, and standards of a farming produce. Clause 4.3 goes like this. The quality, grade, and standards for pesticide residue, food safety standards, good farming practices, and labor and social development standards may also be adopted in the farming agreement. Look at that. The corporate can even reject the final delivery just citing good farming practices were not followed. It's as simple as that. Clause 6.2 even reminds the companies to check for the quality. The clause 6.2 reads like this. The sponsor may, before accepting the delivery of any farming produce, inspect the quality or any other feature of such produce as specified in the farming agreement. With farmers, or for that matter anyone else, not in a position to predict or control the outcome of the production, farmers will be always running the risk of their final produce getting rejected by the sponsors. If the market prices are lower than the price agreed in the contract, the sponsor can always use this clause to entirely decline to purchase or to force the farmers to sell at lower price. This Farm Act would lead to a situation where the sponsors, a bunch of agro-corporate companies, would start deciding what crops, when, where, and how much to produce. The crop pattern could easily get aligned with the export market, as that would be more attractive and profitable for the companies. With the corporate in full control of all the inputs, including the seed varieties, the entire crop pattern will undergo a shift, and the biodiversity and richness would be put severely under threat. Farmers will be forced to produce what their sponsors want and will be turned into mere contract laborers of the companies in their own land. Even none of the state laws can come to their rescue, as the clause 7.1 completely exempt the commodities produced under farming agreements from all state laws. The clause is like this. It reads like, where a farming agreement has been entered into in respect of any farming produce under this act, such produce shall be exempt from the application of any state act by whatever name called, established for the purpose of regulation of sale and purchase of such farming produce. So the state will have absolutely no role to play, even if it wants to come to the rescue of the farmers. Now, after all these, is the middleman removed by all these acts as claimed? Of course not. Apart from the fact that the corporate themselves become the new middlemen, it also brings in aggregators and farm service providers as the new middlemen in the farming agreement. The clause 10 reads like this: save as otherwise provided in this act, an aggregator or farm service provider may become a party to the farming agreement, and in such cases the role and service of such aggregators or farm services providers shall be explicitly mentioned in such farming agreement. Because the corporate cannot deal with the farmers, even the big farmers, so always they will use the service providers as intermediaries or middlemen. Thus, it's a total free hand for the corporate to decide how they want to shape the Indian agriculture so as to profit to the maximum. If these are not enough, the third act free them from the Essential Commodity Act's provisions as well, so as to allay any fears the corporate may have about state intervention in their business. The third act is named as Essential Commodities Amendment Act 2020. This act pretty much nullifies the Essential Commodities Act of 1955. Most of us would think food is the most essential commodity. Strangely, our government thinks otherwise. Maybe for them, the corporate profit tops the list. The act removes the foodstuffs, including like rice, wheat, pulses, potato, onion, oil seeds, and edible oil, pretty much every single food item that we need for our day-to-day life from the list of essential commodities. What that implies is that government neither can intervene to prevent hoarding and black marketing of these items, nor can regulate the prices of these commodities. The original act was established to ensure the availability of commodities that are essential for us to lead our normal life and to be vigilant against hoarding and black marketing and deliberate obstruction of the supply of these essential products. In effect, this new act is making hoarding and black marketing legal for the corporate. The act severely restrains government from exercising any control over hoarders. Government is not allowed to impose any stock holding limits for these newly delisted products, except for extreme exceptions like war, famine, etc. The method of calculating the extreme price rise is a joke. Corporate can keep increasing the price as long as they make sure the moving average of the price over the last 12 months remains just below 50%. Another strange rider is that even these limited criteria cannot be applied if, quote, the stock limit doesn't exceed the overall ceiling of the installed capacity of processing or the demand for export in case of an exporter, unquote. That is, if the company has huge warehouse, they can stock as much they want even if the price skyrockets. Government takes extreme care to make sure that the operation of private businesses and corporate do not face any difficulties from anyone, including government agencies, judiciary, or citizens in their quest for profit. The act will be a huge threat to the food security of the country and will kill the already weakened PDS, public distribution system, as the state governments will have to now beg the corporate for grains and other foodstuffs to distribute through the PDS outlets for the poor. Instead of strengthening the Essential Commodities Acts and PDS systems to ensure availability of most essential stuffs like food to all, the government is encouraging the corporate to profit from even people's hunger. At a time when people are unemployed and hardly have any purchasing power, subjecting them to food price inflation is simply an unpardonable crime against humanity. Eyeing the newfound opportunity and government's willingness to even sell India to appropriate wealth for a few elites, dozens of agro-corporate entities have mushroomed in the recent past. More than 50 agro companies have been registered in the last 2 years by the likes of Reliance, Adani, Patanjali, etc. These corporates are now going to decide what Indians should eat and even how much they should eat, as a greater share of agricultural products may be set aside for export. Government is going all out to ensure a free hand for the domestic and foreign corporate to have a field day with the newly opened up agriculture sector. It is not only domestic conglomerates like Ambani's, but foreign corporate like Walmart, Cargill, etc. are also eyeing the Indian agriculture sector to get their share of the pie, where they can ensure more export from India at a much higher profit by paying as cheap as possible to the farmers, especially now that the MSP is out of the picture. The unregulated and unlimited export of food grains will lead to massive food shortage and crisis with rampant hoarding and black marketing, and eventual victims would be poor farmers and the dispossessed majority of this country. Ultimately, it's life the poor who hardly own any equity in the nation's wealth which is going to be more miserable. Therefore, it is important to educate the people about the threat posed by these new farm acts to their livelihood and their future in order to evoke widespread mass support for the historic struggle being led by the farmers. A strong and relentless people resistance alone can force the government to repeal the new farm acts that are anti-farmer, anti-people and anti-national. Thank you.